When their 77-year-old father died in late September, his two sons came home to Lanark County to settle what remained. Derek and Mitchell received the farmhouse, the grain bins, the equipment shed, the John Deere tractor, 60 head of Hereford cattle, and every flat, workable acre their father had spent 4 decades improving. Norman, the eldest, born of their father's first marriage, before Sylvia had arrived with her 2 boys and her careful reorganization of everything that came before her, received 95 acres of Canadian shield rock and bogland at the far southern edge of the property. The land flooded every spring when the snowmelt came off the limestone ridges. It baked into cracked clay by August. 2 separate land assessors had told his father, years earlier, that the cost of draining it would exceed any possible return. Sylvia called it an equal share of a difficult estate. Derek said Norman should list it before freeze-up and take whatever he could find. 3 days later, Norman drove a rusted half-ton down an overgrown 2-track to the old maple sugar shack at the edge of the bog. Under a tarp in the corner, behind stacked buckets and a broken evaporator pan, he found a steel ammunition box with a padlock. The key was hanging on a nail above the door frame. Inside the box sat 19 handwritten notebooks, a folded geological survey map, and a small rectangle of paper tucked beneath the final volume. The handwriting was his father's, large, deliberate, slanted slightly to the right. It said only this: "Whatever you do, do not fill the bog." Everyone believed Norman Quade had inherited nothing. They had no idea what his father had hidden beneath that water. Norman Quade was 51 years old when his father died. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches, broad through the shoulders and narrow at the hip, with dark hair gone entirely gray above the temples, and a face weathered by 30 years of outdoor work in every season Ontario could arrange. His eyes were a pale, steady blue that people sometimes read as coldness, though it was not coldness. It was the particular stillness of a man who had learned early that feelings carried privately do not stop being real. He spoke carefully. He listened longer than most people expected. Edgar Quade had been a quiet, deliberate man who built things slowly and kept his opinions private. He was tall and lean through the torso in the way of men who have worked hard and eaten plainly all their lives, with large work-shaped hands and a face deeply lined from 4 decades of Lanark County weather. He had not been openly affectionate, not with Norman, not with anyone, but he had an old-fashioned steadiness that Norman had spent his adult life trying to measure himself against. Edgar died on a Tuesday in late September, quietly, in the bedroom he had slept in for 40 years. He was 77. The will was read in a lawyer's office in Perth. The lawyer was a careful woman who had handled Edgar's affairs for 15 years and who read the document without inflection, as though the words bore no particular weight. Norman sat with his hands on his knees. Beside him sat Sylvia Quade, 62, a trim woman with silver-streaked auburn hair held in a deliberate style, wearing a dark wool blazer and holding a folded tissue she did not use. Her eyes were dry. They had been dry since the hospital. Across the room sat Derek Quade, 43, stocky and confident, with close-cropped dark hair, a square jaw, and the habit of sitting with one arm across the back of the nearest chair, as though occupying the room were a decision he had already made. Beside him sat Mitchell Quade, 39, leaner, with sandy hair that fell forward over his forehead, and hands that moved without purpose, the particular restlessness of a man who had spent most of his adult life agreeing with whoever stood closest to him. When the lawyer finished, Derek looked at Norman with a slow smile that carried more relief than cruelty. "At least it stays in the family," he said. Mitchell nodded. Norman stared at Sylvia for one long moment. Her expression did not carry grief. It carried the quiet satisfaction of a calculation that had come out right. The anger that moved through him then was sharp enough to make his hands unsteady on the table. He thought of the winters he had driven home to help when Derek was traveling, and Mitchell had disappeared into town. He thought of the hospital visits, the fence repairs no one asked for, The springs he had spent fixing equipment that belonged to a farm he had been quietly written out of. He thought about all the ways a person could be made to feel unnecessary without a single unkind word being spoken directly at them. He picked up the pen. He signed. The farmhouse sat a kilometer from the bog, visible through a gap in the spruce line on clear mornings. Within the week, Derek had a contractor out to repaint the front fence and put up a new sign at the end of the laneway. Mitchell's truck appeared in the yard most evenings, their voices carried across the field on quiet nights. The easy comfort of men who believed they had been given exactly what they deserved. Norman moved into the sugar shack. He replaced 2 rotted wallboards, patched the roof with metal sheeting, salvaged from a barn demolition, and installed a wood stove from a neighbor's property. He cleared a corner for a cot, hung a lamp from the ceiling joist, and brought 2 changes of clothes, a kettle, his tools, and the 19 notebooks. He read them by lamplight, starting from the first page of the first volume. Edgar had kept meticulous records going back 22 years. Water temperatures measured at 6 distinct points in the bog, seasonal sketches of the drainage patterns, notes on the movement of surface water across different sections of the property, diagrams of the limestone ridgeline above the southern quarter. He had documented where water appeared to surface on its own, even in August, when the Tay Creek ran low. He had tracked the pH of different pools. He had noted which insects hatched above which sections of water, and at what temperatures they did so. Some pages contained clipped articles about brook trout cultivation from agricultural journals. Others had hand-drawn maps with elevation markings and flow direction arrows. On page 11 of the 7th notebook, in small print beside a column of temperature readings, Edgar had written, "Cold springs here. Consistent, not seasonal. Underground source." Norman sat with that notebook in his hands for a long time. He had grown up beside this bog. He had walked the edge of it as a boy. He had always thought of it as a nuisance. The place where equipment got stuck in April, where the mosquitoes came from in July, where the ground swallowed fence posts. But his father had spent 22 years reading it as something else entirely. Norman went out and began walking it the same way. Every morning before the sun cleared the spruce ridge, he pulled on his rubber boots and walked the bog with a marked measuring pole and a water thermometer borrowed from the farm co-op in town. He learned to find the cold water by feel first. A sudden drop in temperature near the 3rd pool, where groundwater pushed up through fractures in the limestone shelf and entered the surface drainage. He measured oxygen levels with a field kit. He tracked where water moved and where it collected. He noticed slowly that the bog was not a stagnant system. It had a direction. He also noticed the otters. A family of river otters lived along the eastern inlet. 3 adults and 2 young ones who surfaced near the 2nd pool on the first morning and then vanished before he could get close. He watched them over the following weeks. They were not random in their movements. The adults worked a natural choke point in the inlet channel with steady, unhurried efficiency, clearing debris and widening the passage the way a good farmer maintains a drainage ditch. Not all at once, but consistently, a little each day. In Notebook 12, Edgar had sketched them with a brief note in the margin. "Keep the otters. They're doing the work I haven't managed yet." By his 2nd winter at the shack, Norman had filled 4 notebooks of his own. Inside the back cover of the 14th of his father's notebooks, he found a folded geological survey printout marked up in pencil. Edgar had circled 5 distinct cold water upwelling points in red and drawn lines connecting them toward the bog's natural outlet with a note written alongside. 3 degrees Celsius, year-round. Brook trout optimal range, 8 to 18. Spring water manages summer highs. This could work. Norman stood at the small table in the sugar shack for a very long time after reading that page. The stove had burned down, and the room had grown cold without him noticing. His father had seen a brook trout operation in this bog. Not a wish, a plan. built on temperature data and soil surveys and 22 years of careful private observation. He had simply not lived long enough to build it himself. By the following spring, Norman had spent nearly everything he had saved across 28 years of farm work. He bought corrugated pipe, timber, screening material, gravel, and simple wooden water gates. He drove to a hatchery near Charbot Lake and came home with 2,000 juvenile brook trout in aerated tanks on the truck bed. He had borrowed modestly, enough to press the bog against his name as collateral. And he felt the weight of every purchase in the way a man feels a load he has chosen to carry. He laid the pipe channels himself, following his father's maps rather than cutting straight lines across the property. He built low wooden control gates at the natural pinch points Edgar had marked. He worked waist-deep in cold water through most of May and June, his hands splitting from wet rope and rough lumber, the bog smell permanently in his clothes. He reinforced unstable sections of the inlet banks. With flat limestone slabs, he pulled from the ridgeline by hand. He left the otter's territory completely untouched. When the first brook trout arrived, dark-backed and vivid, with orange-tipped fins and flanks that glowed like embers in cold water, he stood at the edge of the upper pool and watched until the last one disappeared beneath a shaded ledge. For the first time since the will had been read, he allowed himself to believe that his father had known exactly what he was doing. That belief held for 7 months. A wet October brought 3 days of hard rain across Lanark County. The limestone ridges above the southern quarter shed water faster than the bog's channels could absorb it. By midnight of the second night, the upper pool had overtopped its bank, and the primary inlet gate was trembling under the load. Norman worked by flashlight, stacking sandbags and gravel-filled sacks against the breach while rain ran cold down the back of his neck. The otters had retreated far up the eastern channel. At 4 in the morning, the west bank gave way, and water tore through the opening, carrying pipe alignment, gravel beds, and screening frames out through the drainage and into the lower creek. He lost more than half his trout. 2 days later, Derek slowed his truck on the township road above the bog and looked down at the damage. He did not stop. He rolled the window down partway. "Still not too late to sell," he called. Then he drove on. Norman turned back to the mud and started over. The second year went more steadily. He repaired the damaged sections, reduced his fish numbers, and installed heavier overflow channels at 3 points along the perimeter. By midsummer, he had several thousand healthy brook trout holding in the coldest pools. He sold small quantities to a fish market in Perth and a roadside restaurant near Carlton Place. The income was not large, but it covered what it needed to cover. Then, in August of that same year, Norman arrived at the upper inlet and found it blocked. Not by debris, not by the otters. The wooden inlet screen had been cleanly removed, bolts taken out, not broken, and a flexible pipe had been laid from an upstream drainage ditch into the cold water channel. Warm, turbid water, carrying silt and summer algae, had been mixing into 2 of the 5 pools for long enough that the fish in those sections were stressed and surfacing. Norman worked for 6 hours with a net and buckets, moving what he could to the colder pools downstream, but by evening the banks were lined with dead fish in the grass. The smell did not leave the bog for days. The Ontario provincial police officer who came the following morning walked the inlet with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything. His name was Raymond Sproul. 45, compact and deliberate, with close-cropped gray hair, dark eyes that studied things twice before moving on, and the particular patience of a man who had grown up on a dairy farm in Renfrew County, and believed that the truth could usually be found if you were willing to stay at the scene longer than the other person expected. He photographed the clean bolt holes in the screen frame, the pipe placement, the quad tire marks on the access lane. Someone knew what they were doing, he said, and they knew where to do it. He had no name yet. The name came 3 weeks later, from a young man named Aaron Duff. Aaron Duff was 24 years old, slight and pale, with sandy hair that fell forward over his eyes, and a stillness about him that was not calm. It was the particular quietness of a person who had spent years working for men who punished honesty. He showed up at the sugar shack door on a Wednesday morning and told Norman, without being asked, that Derek had paid him to redirect the ditch water and remove the screen. Derek had told him the fish would recover quickly. He had told him Norman would sell the property within the month. Norman stood in the doorway with one hand on the doorframe and said nothing for a long time. He did not drive to the farmhouse. He drove to Sproul's office with Aaron's written statement, came back to the bog, and sat at the table in the dark for a long time without lighting the lamp. The bank's reminder letter had arrived that week. He had money left for feed and fuel, for perhaps 6 more weeks. He made a list of what he could part with: the truck, the generator, some of the pipe he had not yet laid. Then a late summer storm came in from the northwest. It rained for 2 days without stopping. On the second morning, Norman walked the bog in his rain jacket and found that a section of the bank above the 4th pool had sheared away overnight. A plate of limestone slabs the size of a kitchen table had calved free and slid into the shallow edge of the pool. Where it had rested, a crack in the bedrock had been exposed. Cold, clear water was pushing steadily out of it with a force he had not seen anywhere else on the property. He lowered his thermometer, 3.5 degrees Celsius, in August. He ran back to the sugar shack, boots leaving mud across the floor, and pulled Notebook 14 from the stack. He found the geological survey printout in 4 minutes. His father had circled that exact hillside in red with a note beside the circle: primary cold source. Sealed underslab fall years ago. Cannot access. This is the one that makes it work. Norman stood in the doorway of the sugar shack, with the notebook pressed against his chest, and the rain coming off the eave an inch from his face. The storm had not broken what he had built. It had uncovered what he needed to save it. Within a week, he had redirected the surviving trout toward the newly exposed spring. The temperature in the upper pools stabilized at a level he had only achieved briefly during the coldest weeks of the previous winter. The fish responded within the month. Their movement quickened, their coloring deepened. For the first time since the operation began, every pool held healthy fish from inlet to outlet, sustained by a cold source, consistent enough to carry through the worst weeks of a Lanark County summer. 3 years after the spring was uncovered, Dead Rock Bog, which Norman had begun writing in his notebooks as if it were a proper address, no longer resembled the land 2 assessors had written off as a liability. Clear channels moved cold water through all 5 pools. Plank walkways crossed the softest ground. A small cleaning shed stood behind the sugar shack. The Otter family had expanded into 2 additional inlet channels and continued managing the debris load with the same patient efficiency Edgar had documented 20 years earlier. Norman sold brook trout to 3 fish markets and a handful of restaurants within 50 kilometers of the property. He kept his harvest numbers below what he calculated the water could sustainably support each season, and he was rigid about it. The income was enough to close out the bank loan and replace the truck he had nearly sold. The turn came on an afternoon in early September when a woman named Ingrid Blackwell stopped for lunch at a restaurant in Perth, Ontario. Ingrid Blackwell was 49 years old, tall and angular, with close-cut gray hair and sharp dark eyes behind frameless glasses. She had opened her first restaurant in Toronto's West End at 32, lost it at 37 when she expanded faster than the market was ready for, and rebuilt her reputation at 40 by sourcing ingredients personally from producers she visited herself. She had a trained palate and the habit of asking questions that made kitchen staff nervous and farmers feel, for the first time in years, that what they knew actually mattered to someone. The restaurant served her pan-seared brook trout with local vegetables. She ate it with the focused attention she gave to everything that surprised her. Then she set down her fork and asked the owner where it had come from. The following morning, she arrived at the sugar shack in city boots that were immediately wrecked by the mud near the second pool. Norman watched her come down the plank walkway and expected a buyer who would want more fish for less money. Instead, she spent 3 hours examining the pools, asking about water temperature variance, the spring source, the otter activity, the harvest limits. When Norman explained his father's notebooks and the geological survey, she listened without once reaching for her phone. "I've eaten a great deal of brook trout," she said, at the end of it. "This is different." "The water's cold," Norman said. "It's the water and the patience," she said. "You didn't rush the system." Ingrid offered a long-term supply agreement for her Toronto restaurant, and 2 others operated by her business partners. The price she named was nearly double what Norman had been receiving locally. He told her the numbers would always depend on water health and fish population. He would not commit to volumes he could not guarantee from one season to the next. She agreed without hesitation, and the expression she gave him was one of genuine relief. Within 18 months, Dead Rock Bog brook trout appeared on menus in Toronto, Kingston, and Ottawa. A research team from Carleton University came to document the spring-fed ecosystem. Photographs of Norman standing beside the clear pools and the old sugar shack ran in the Ottawa Citizen in a feature on small Ontario food operations building something worth keeping. High-end restaurants called months in advance. Norman maintained a waiting list and did not expand his operation beyond what the water could hold. The drought came the following summer and the summer after that. 2 consecutive seasons of below-average rainfall across eastern Ontario turned the flat pasture land of the main Quade farm into something that cracked underfoot by early July. The hay was thin. The stock pond dropped below a usable level before the end of summer. Derek's Hereford cattle lost condition faster than purchased could correct. He borrowed against the pasture at the beginning of the first dry summer, convinced that one strong season would bring the numbers back into line. The second drought summer arrived, and the numbers continued moving in the wrong direction. Dead Rock Bog remained full. The cold springs ran at the same temperature and volume they had held through 22 years of Edgar's measurements. The otter-managed inlet channels carried clean water through all 5 pools without interruption. The land that 2 assessors had called a liability did not drop by a measurable inch, while the flat, workable pasture that everyone had agreed was the good part of the property cracked and browned in the August heat. The bank sent foreclosure notices to the farmhouse before the first frost. Derek came to the bog on a Tuesday evening in November. He had lost weight. His jacket hung open despite the cold. The confidence he usually carried like a second coat was gone, and without it he looked smaller and older and more tired than Norman had ever seen him. Mitchell had come with him but stayed near the truck, hands in his pockets. Derek crossed the plank walkway alone. He stood at the edge of the nearest pool for a moment without speaking, watching the dark water move beneath the early evening light. Then he asked Norman to sell him the lower 25 acres, enough clean water frontage to secure another loan and put one more season together. Norman said nothing. Derek's voice dropped. "Name a price, whatever it needs to be." Norman looked at the water moving through the 5 pools in the failing light. He shook his head once. "You told me this ground wasn't worth surveying," he said. Derek lowered his eyes to the plank under his boots. Norman turned back toward the shack and left him standing there. The auction was held on a gray Friday morning in early December. The Quade farmhouse, the cattle, the equipment, and 310 acres of Lanark County farmland were offered as a single parcel. The auction hall in Perth was more crowded than anyone had expected. Neighbors, investors, reporters, and people who had come simply because they had heard the story and wanted to be present when it reached its end. Derek and Mitchell stood near the far wall. Sylvia sat alone on a wooden bench near the window with her hands folded in her lap. The precision she had always kept in her appearance had slipped. The auburn hair showed long gray roots, and the proud composure she had carried for decades had been replaced by something smaller and quieter, and much more honest. The auctioneer moved through the bidding with professional efficiency. Norman waited near the back of the room until the price had climbed past the point where the serious outside investors had stopped raising their hands. Then he lifted his paddle. He bid without glancing at Derek, or Mitchell, or Sylvia. He bid without expression or calculation visible on his face. He continued until the gavel came down. Nobody in the room spoke for a moment. Then the room began to move again, voices low, people turning to each other with the particular energy of those who have just watched something they will describe for the rest of the year. Norman completed the paperwork at the clerk's table, thanked her, and walked outside into the cold December air. Derek was at the bottom of the steps with Mitchell just behind him. Sylvia had followed. Derek's face held the look of a man who had rehearsed something on the drive over, and now found that none of it applied. "We'll be out by the end of the week," Derek said quietly. "You won't have to ask." Norman looked at the old set of brass house keys resting in his palm, the same keys Edgar had carried in his front coat pocket for 40 years. He turned them once. Then he held them out toward Derek. Derek looked at the keys for a long moment before he understood what was being offered. "It's your father's farm," Norman said. "Take care of it properly." "After what I did," Derek said. "After all of it, why?" Norman looked past him toward the empty fields, the same fields where Edgar had taught all three of them to read a sky before rain, to leave the corners of a field for the deer, to fix a fence properly the first time, so you didn't have to fix it twice. "He didn't build this for us to fight over it," Norman said. "He built it because he believed land should be taken care of." Something went out of Derek then, not gradually but all at once, the way a held breath releases. His eyes filled and he did not turn away from it. "I was afraid of you," he said. His voice was unsteady. "I was afraid of what it meant if you were right about the bog. So I tried to make sure you failed. I hired Aaron to damage your inlet because I couldn't stand the thought of losing to a piece of land I'd laughed at." He shook his head. "I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry." Norman stepped forward and put a hand on his brother's shoulder. Mitchell had turned away, chin to his chest. Sylvia came forward last. She had composed herself on the walk down the steps, but the composure was worn through in places, and what showed beneath it was not the calculation Norman remembered from the lawyer's office. It was an old, tired fear that had finally run out of room to live in. Her voice was unsteady when she spoke. She told him that she had sat with Edgar in his final days, during the weeks when he was weakened and disoriented, and more easily redirected than he would have been in health. She had not changed the will herself. She had simply spoken to him, again and again, until he had agreed with what she said. She had told him Norman would leave if he received the bog, that he would sell it and go west, and that her boys would be left to manage the estate without the complication of a half-brother who had always been more capable than either of them. She had told herself it was a practical decision. She had believed that if Norman was given the worst land, the difficulty of him would resolve itself quietly. "I thought you would disappear," she said. She was looking at the ground. "I didn't believe anyone would stay in a place like that." Norman held her gaze for a moment. "You were wrong about the land," he said, "but so was everyone else." She nodded once, and that was enough for both of them. 10 years passed. Dead Rock Bog became one of the most studied cold spring, brook trout operations in Ontario. Graduate researchers from 3 universities came to document the spring-fed water system and the role of the otter colonies in maintaining channel health through Ontario's increasingly dry summers. Sustainable food writers included it in features about Canadian producers doing things the careful way. Restaurants in Toronto competed for position on a waiting list that Norman kept by hand in a notebook with the same patience he had brought to everything else. Visitors to the property, and there were many, Eventually, all noticed the same thing before they noticed anything else. Beside the door of the old sugar shack, on the original weathered plank that Edgar Quade had installed 40 years earlier, someone had attached a piece of oak with words carved into it. Not many words, just what was needed. God hides his finest gifts in the places men are too proud to look. Edgar Quade had never been a church-going man. He had never quoted scripture at the dinner table or posted signs along his fence posts, but he had walked that bog for 22 years, taking temperature readings, making sketches, writing things down in notebooks no one else was meant to read, because he believed the land held something true if you were willing to be quiet long enough to hear it. Norman had understood that, finally, on a wet August morning, when he pressed a rained notebook against his chest and stood in a doorway with cold spring water running behind him and the sound of the otters working in the Eastern Channel. Sometimes the blessing does not arrive looking like a blessing. Sometimes it comes labeled as the thing no one wanted, left to the person everyone assumed would go away quietly. Norman Quade did not go away quietly. He simply went to work. Before we leave today, take a moment to consider this. Sometimes God does not remove the difficult ground from your path. Sometimes he places your greatest purpose inside it, and he waits to see if you are willing to stay long enough to find it. Norman was handed what everyone agreed was the worst piece of land on the property. Rocky, flooded, laughed at. But God could already see what no one else could. That beneath the shallow water and the cracked clay, and all the years of being told it was worthless, lay something no amount of fertile inherited pasture could have produced. Patience, knowledge, the quiet faithfulness of a person who keeps working when no one is watching and no one is applauding, and the bank letters have already arrived. Maybe you are carrying your own dead rock bog right now, a difficulty that doesn't look like an opportunity, a season that feels like punishment rather than preparation, a corner of your life where someone told you, kindly or not, that the ground beneath your feet wasn't worth much. Don't leave it too soon. As Romans 8:28 reminds us, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, even when we cannot see the design. Even when the water is cold and the loss feels too large to come back from, he is already working beyond what our eyes can reach. If this story touched something in you tonight, we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your words might be exactly what someone else needed to read on a hard day. And if you believe in stories about patience, land, forgiveness, and the gifts hidden in difficult places, subscribe to the Quiet Hour Tales and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. May God bless you and keep your family close, give you strength in the hard seasons, and remind you on the days it's hardest to believe that his plans are always larger than the difficulty you can presently see. Thank you for being here tonight. We'll see you in the next one.